This is Gracie Gatto Podcast, and I'm Gracie Gatto. Boy, what a week. Gordon MacDonald is on medical leave. It's a sorry state, pun intended, when we no longer know whether to trust a press announcement from the New Hampshire Supreme Court. Before last week's sudden announcement, and we truly hope he's okay, about Chief Justice MacDonald's leave of absence, he and the court were already facing some serious scrutiny. There was reportedly an ongoing investigation into him when that medical leave was announced. So, what assurances do we have that this is the truth and not just another cover-up while they figure out how to get themselves out of a serious bind? The announcement didn't even come from the court's regular spokesperson. It came from someone at WMUR, State Television News. And it landed one day after new information was added to an ethics complaint against Jane Young for conflicts of interest, representing MacDonald. She represented him after NHPR exposed a $50,000 payout to Diane Martin, his subordinate, allegedly at his direction. Laid off from one court position, rehired in another, just to get the money. So Jane Young reportedly said she and MacDonald would go around Attorney General John Formella straight to Governor Kelly Ayotte if necessary. So let that sit for a second. That's some drama. And that is a complete disregard for one's own successor's office. Bad form, Jane. So Jane Young sat on the Attorney Disciplinary Office's screening committee. MacDonald's office appoints the director of the administrative offices of that court, and the same office that governs the Attorney Disciplinary Office. So in other words, he built a closed circuit, one with no door marked accountability. So the judicial branch hired a PR firm last October, $10,000 a month. The image has only gotten worse. $70,000 later. So the judiciary has tried to block right-to-know requests about its own press announcements, claiming the judicial branch isn't even subject to 91A. But here's the thing about walls. The judiciary tore its own down. The Chief Justice controls the administrative offices of the court and the Attorney Disciplinary Office. And the same law firm, Drummond Woodsum, represents both of those offices and the New Hampshire Municipal Association. So when you tear down that wall, you lose the ability to hide behind sovereign immunity. You open yourself up to something else entirely. Claims of racketeering. And we should not forget this. When Gordon MacDonald was Attorney General, he was copied on some emails about getting the state forensic lab to tamper with material evidence. That tampered evidence became the excuse for a grand jury criminal investigation, one that generated business and revenue for his law firm, Nixon Peabody. And while he was calling for a grand jury investigation into a private school using tampered evidence, he dismissed claims of extreme child abuse, sexual abuse at the state's youth detention center as quote-unquote victim negligence. So is this really a medical event, or is this a cover-up while the judiciary scrambles to figure out its next move in a crisis of its own making? Let's talk about the instinct. In 2002, an attorney general named Phil McLaughlin read a story in the Boston Globe about priests and church and children in a church that knew. And he did something almost nobody in power does when trouble is happening next door. He assumed it was happening here too. He told his staff, and I'm going to get close to his words because they matter, that he didn't believe the news, quote, stops at the magic border. You know, that fictitious line in the sand that divides New Hampshire and Massachusetts. 14 months later, A 154-page report, hundreds of accusations, dozens of priests. I keep thinking about that instinct. Not the scandal, but the instinct. The refusal to believe a state line is a moral firewall. Because right now in 2026, there's a different institution asking us to believe exactly that. And I don't buy it any more than McLaughlin did. The lab under the badge. Now, here's a structural fact that doesn't get said out loud enough. New Hampshire's forensic lab, DNA, rape kits, drug, chemistry, firearms, all of it is not an independent body. It sits inside the Department of Safety, under the state police. The people who investigate crimes and the people who run the lab that proves the crimes report up the same chain. Now that's not an accusation, that's an org chart. But org charts are where conflicts of interest go to hide in plain sight. So in January of 2019, he learned nearly 600 rape kits sat untested across more than 90 police departments statewide. The state got federal money to fix it. The deputy AG, Jane Young, called the whole effort, quote, a testament to relationships, end quote. That's a single phone call from a sane, SANE nurse, was enough to get the Attorney General's office moving. I want you to sit with that phrase for a second. A testament to relationships. Like, what is that? That's a nice way of saying this system runs on who you know, not on structural accountability. Ugh. And when the system runs on relationships, it also fails on relationships. Quietly, without headlines, until someone forces it into the light. The criminalist. So let me reintroduce you to someone. His name is Kevin McMahon. If you don't follow New Hampshire criminal trials closely, you've never heard of that name. But if you followed a major case in this state over the last 3 decades, you've heard his testimony. Kevin McMahon was a criminalist at the New Hampshire State Police Forensic Laboratory. You know, the state's only lab, the one lab that processes DNA, drug chemistry, firearms evidence, you know, for every police department in New Hampshire. Yeah, that's the one. So if your case needed forensic evidence, it went through him or someone like him. So for decades, he was one of the state's go-to expert witnesses. Put on the stand, sworn in, trusted by juries because the word State Police Forensic Laboratory carries weight. Here's what most jurors never got to hear. Kevin McMahon has a disciplinary record that goes back decades. And it's not just like one-off incident. A record, a letter of warning in the file going as far back as 1997. Questions raised about his own DNA turning up on evidence he'd handled and documented in his own personnel file. A proposition made to a subordinate, the kind of conduct that gets written up and kept on record for a reason. And through all of it, the state kept calling him back. You know, trial after trial, case after case. The man with the file kept getting handed the microphone. In 2023, he was suspended. He retired that same year. In 2024, the New Hampshire Personnel Appeals Board ruled on his appeal. Docket 2024-D-010. I've read that ruling. I've quoted from it before on this show in a different episode built entirely around his record. It confirms what the pattern already told us. This wasn't like one bad day. It was a career-length file that the state kept deciding not to act on until it finally did. Now, here's my question. Did Kevin McMahon do anything wrong? The Personnel Appeals Board already answered that. My question is this. How many verdicts in this state were built, at least in part, on testimony from a man the state itself knew had a problem and put him on the stand anyway? That's not a McMahon problem. That's a system problem. The pattern that repeats itself. In 2017, the Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence said something true about St. Paul's School. That hiring your own outside, quote, investigators instead of calling the police is a culture that puts reputation ahead of safety, end quote. I'd like someone to explain to me why that principle applies to private boarding schools and stops applying the moment we're talking about a state lab. A state youth facility, a state agency's own internal review process. McLaughlin didn't believe a state line was a moral firewall. Well, I don't believe an org chart is one either. I'm not telling you Kevin McMahon did anything wrong. I'm not telling you the lab covered anything up. I don't have that kind of proof, but until I do, I won't say it. What I'm telling you is this. Every time this state has been asked to look at itself, the church in 2002, St. Paul's in 2017, the rape kits in 2019, the Sununu Youth Services Center right now in 2026. The first instinct from the institution is always the same. Not here, not us. That's someone else's problem. McLaughlin didn't believe it in 2002. I don't believe it now. This is Gracie Gatto, and we'll see you on the other side.